Chapter 9. The Vodou Priestess. With Gabriella safely mandated to City Hospital's psychiatric ward for a minimum of 3 days, Madeline could now confront any impending dangers without interference. After leaving the hospital, she drove into an Upper Ninth Ward neighborhood called the Bywater. Settled along the edge of the Mississippi River, the distinctively recognizable subdistrict of New Orleans was colorfully reminiscent of French, Spanish, and Caribbean colonial architecture. Although less than a mile from the French Quarter, the Bywater felt worlds away and was the ultimate sanctuary for true New Orleanians, old and new. Madeline parked outside a beautifully decorated double shotgun duplex renovated into a single residence. By day, the house radiated light off its bright turquoise blue exterior wood paneling and vibrant yellow and pink trim. By night, it glowed, illuminated by strings of lights flickering off the abundant green foliage and flowers wrapped around the yellow columns on the front deck. With a white picket fence encasing a lush tropical garden, it was the most enticingly magical house on the street, belonging to the most famous woman in the neighborhood, Vodou Priestess Heloise. Priestess Heloise was another modern New Orleans legend and a longtime New Orleanian of Haitian descent. She had spent most of her life traveling back and forth between her house in Louisiana and her grandmother's home in Haiti, which she had recently inherited. Having dedicated her life to the acquiring of religious knowledge and the understanding of spirituality, she used her influence in both countries to remove the stigma attached to the different forms of voodoo and dispel the negative connotations falsely and negligently imposed on its name. Long before the colorful shops in and around New Orleans sold the commercialized version of Louisiana voodoo, Voodoo, to tourists and local enthusiasts, international voodoo, Vodou, was a dominant religion in many countries and cultures around the world. Its origin was based on the universal belief in God the Creator and the mastering of the natural forces of the spiritual plane in a multi-dimensional reality. But for Priestess Heloise, modern voodoo was a hybrid combination of the ancient African and Haitian religions and her secondary religion of Roman Catholicism. Priestess Heloise's grandmother had sent her to a Catholic academy in southern Louisiana when she was 5 years old, and she was raised almost exclusively by strict Catholic nuns. By age 16, Heloise considered taking vows and grew to emulate the nuns' discipline and poise through a life of dedication to prayer and the practice of chastity. But after a mission back to Haiti at age 18, she decided to stay, attended university there, and took up the study of her native religion for the next 7 years. Heloise returned to New Orleans ordained a Haitian voodoo mambo, taking the title of Vodou Priestess in the United States. Highly educated and steadfastly dedicated to charitable service, she became one of the most respected and sought-after religious healers and clairvoyants in the world. While especially praised in the Bywater, her popularity and wide appeal had her known only as the Priestess all over New Orleans. But Madeline's connection to Priestess Heloise went far beyond notoriety. Madeline had considered making a home in New Orleans for most of her life, and had moved there with the hopes of finding her place in a multicultural city that embraced a combination of religions. As a child, Madeline had never been fully able to develop her religious awareness because of its banishment by her parents. But she nourished herself as needed by secretly stopping into the Immaculate Conception Church of Salem each day on her way home from school. and coincidentally, a church was where she had met Priestess Heloise, at the St. Louis Cathedral in New Orleans. They both attended the late morning Mass every Sunday and shared an immediate kinship, and Madeline began seeing Priestess Heloise for spiritual guidance regularly ever since. Eager to get inside and see the priestess, Madeline locked the car and ran up the sidewalk. It was close to midnight, but Priestess Heloise always did her most important work just before dawn, and Madeline knew she would understand her late arrival. Madeline would have called ahead to announce her visit, but Priestess Heloise had never owned a telephone and only accepted in-person communication. When Madeline opened the gate leading onto the front garden, she felt an instant shift in the energy around her. She hadn't felt such positivity since the last time she saw Priestess Heloise more than a month before. With the severity of her nightmares progressing and the resulting toll on her body increasingly debilitating, Madeline had retreated to the safety of her apartment and abandoned the outside world except for work. When she reached the porch and knocked softly on the front door, she regretted waiting until then to reconnect. Priestess Heloise was, after all, her closest friend, and after years of companionship, they had become family. Priestess Heloise opened the door with an uneasy smile on her face. Usually a serious woman, it was a sign of worry, not satisfaction. Priestess Heloise was 60, but had glowing chocolate-brown skin as smooth as she had when 20 years younger. She was medium height with a slender build and had completely gray hair in thin braids down to her waist. Never adorning herself with flashy beads or headdresses, she always wore a neutral-colored chiffon wrap dress that trailed to the floor and a white silk scarf swathed around the top of her head. She was naturally beautiful and conservative and always kept her full lips stained a rich coral matte. Her only accessories were 7 gold hoop earrings in each of her ears and an omnipresent white crystal rosary around her neck, identical with the one she had given Madeline. Miss Madeline, it's been a long time. Come in. She hugged Madeline long and hard before closing the door behind them. Feeling safe and vulnerable the moment she walked into the house, Madeline's emotions erupted and she couldn't contain herself before the words plaguing her mind poured from her mouth.
"Heloise, something terrible is happening," she cried. "My past has come back to destroy me just as you predicted it would."
Priestess Heloise remained quiet, but her smile faded, unmasking a stoic gaze as her senses began to attract a world of knowledge she had never before conceived. When she hadn't heard from Madeline in several weeks, she knew something serious was brewing, and that eventually Madeline would resurface and come to her for guidance. Priestess Heloise had prepared herself for that moment, and anticipated its arrival with a strong premonition it would drastically alter both their lives after passing. She put her arm on Madeline's shoulder and led her past the living room, through a beaded doorway, and into her candlelit prayer room. "I'm going to read the spirits," Priestess Heloise said firmly. The prayer room was a visual masterpiece, exquisitely decorated with meticulously preserved Haitian heirlooms of the finest variety. Heavy royal blue satin drapes tied with gold-tasseled ropes covered the windows and bunched gracefully on the floor. A grand chandelier, far too large for the room, hung from the ceiling, coloring everything beneath with the glistening rainbow lights from its hundreds of crystals. The wall on the left had floor-to-ceiling oak bookshelves filled with hundreds of ancient Vodou scrolls, Bibles from multiple religions, and a wide array of historical theology and Eastern and herbal medicine books. And set against the right wall was the heart of the room, her altar. Unlike a public altar on display at a museum or central location, visited all day and containing the many offerings from the people who pray at it, the priestess's private altar was a spiritual sanctuary. It was the sacred place in which she prepared all rituals and where her personal prayer and meditation occurred. The altar consisted of a top and bottom tier made of marble and covered with crisp white canvas. The top tier had a large wooden crucifix raised from the center, surrounded by several oil paintings, statues of the saints, and dripping white candles. The bottom tier held vials of oil, jars of herbs, and bags of healing powders and roots with a stone mortar and pestle to grind them, and 2 large crystal carafes of holy water used only for the blessing of the house sat to the side of a large gold offering bowl. Beautifully organized and in perfect harmony, the entire room encompassed the essence of positive, energy-charged spirituality, and it all revolved around a gold silk-covered table where Priestess Heloise performed all her rituals and readings. Madeline sat down and waited patiently while Priestess Heloise retrieved a small leather bag containing chicken bones, crystals, and alligator teeth, which she carefully spread around the table before taking a seat across from Madeline. "Now tell me, child, what has transpired?" Priestess Heloise asked. "My sister showed up on my doorstep yesterday and told me our parents had found her," Madeline began. "She said they told her our brother was dead, that he'd been killed in prison, and that she was to come back to the family or suffer the same consequences. I flew to Chicago to find out what happened and found not only was he dead, but my parents had orchestrated his murder. We've been hiding from them for 15 years. She's afraid for good reason, and so am I." "How do you know your parents were involved?" Priestess Heloise asked as she began to sift through the artifacts and set them in order on a gold plate. "Because I saw the prison security tape showing the murderer. I recognized him as a longtime associate of my father who had obviously infiltrated the prison system, and my parents had visited my brother multiple times during his incarceration. He had sworn never to contact them again, so I couldn't believe it." "Why do you think your parents would come after you now after so much time in silence?" Madeline looked away from Priestess Heloise and felt her body painfully tense with anxiety once again. If she was going to seek the priestess's help, she needed to be completely honest with her. Madeline had kept her secret for years, having made a pact with Maxwell and Gabriella never to tell a soul, and had adhered to it without exception. It was a disturbing fact about her childhood so shameful she could barely fathom speaking the words. The inhumane nature of her life under the rule of Charles and Claire Jackson was so devious and twisted American society would never have believed it. And Charles and Claire Jackson had carefully designed it that way. But after seeing the grisly manner in which Stephen had savagely executed Maxwell, Madeline had made a promise to avenge his murder, and now she had to take the first step toward keeping it. "My parents are Satanists," Madeline said cautiously. "When we were children, they practiced secretly and taught us the laws of the dark side. I refused to abide by their teachings. As you know, I've always been close to God, but there was a price to pay for what they considered blasphemous. Disobedience meant violent beatings and punishments that lasted for days, even months if the offense was physically harmful. But despite their difficulties with trying to convert us, they made the extent of our expected allegiance to the family abundantly clear. They said they could always rectify defiance, and therefore welcomed it. They enjoyed the process and believed the more viciously they beat us, the darker and more enslaved we would become. The only unbreakable rule was leaving or exposing the family. If we did, they would consider us deserters, hunt us down one by one, and kill us. After a moment of silence, Madeline looked back up at Priestess Heloise and waited for her to respond, but she did not. She simply stood up, walked over to the altar, and lit a cigar. She then began a ritualistic voodoo cleansing consisting of blowing clouds of smoke over Madeline and the artifacts to remove all negative energy attachments and channel in the positive. "Did you ever tell anyone?" Priestess Heloise finally asked. "Yes, but only once, about the beatings, never the truth about what they were. We knew the consequences if we did, and telling wouldn't have mattered anyway. Our parents had a mysterious way of interacting with the people who encountered them. My mother may have looked just like a housewife, but the aura around her was like a repellent. And aside from being the most intimidating man alive, my father was chief of police. It was the perfect cover for a man and woman who secretly controlled the city and had everyone in their debt. People on the outside happily dismissed what they didn't have to see." Priestess Heloise walked behind Madeline's chair, cut off a piece of her hair with a razor-sharp bone-handled knife, and then sat back down across from her. "Give me your hands." She took Madeline's hands and closed her eyes for several moments before opening them. When she did, her expression had changed to one of confusion and concern, but she had no doubt the knowledge she had just envisioned was true. She then prepared to explain to Madeline what she had somehow always known. "There is more danger to your situation than just your parents' vendetta against you," Priestess Heloise began. "It's about you. It's about who you are. I know this is going to be hard for you to accept or understand, but you must trust me and open your mind to realities you cannot immediately see. An imminent shift in the power between the forces of heaven and hell is upon the earth. And you, my child, are in the middle of it. Sides are being drawn, and the solidification of powerful alliances millions of years in the making is coveted more now than ever before." Madeline pulled her hands back. She had known Priestess Heloise for years. She had accompanied her to Haiti every July for the past 4 summers and had never heard her speak about such things. "What are you talking about?" Madeline asked, growing agitated and uncomfortable. "This isn't about me. This is about my parents murdering my brother. If I'm in the middle of it, it's not because they want my soul, it's because they want blood." She stood up and walked over to the altar. "Everywhere I turn, the nightmares of my past continue to haunt me. I've been running from the horror inflicted by my parents since the day I was born, and I'm done with it. Their sins go far beyond the lines of good and evil, and it's time to take my life back. I'm going to find them before they find me and make sure they spend the rest of their lives paying for what they've done." Priestess Heloise had expected Madeline's response and knew there was no way to reach her at that point. Even she didn't fully understand the information she had just extracted and would need to investigate her scrolls to find additional evidence before advising Madeline further. But before allowing Madeline to leave, Priestess Heloise wanted to prepare her for for what she might encounter on her own. Priestess Heloise went to the bookshelf, picked out an ancient voodoo book titled Demonology and Protection, and gave it to Madeline. "Remember why you do the job you do," Priestess Heloise said. "Save the mind to protect the soul. If you're going to go after your parents, you have to do it according to the instructions in this book. Their souls have already been taken. Do this the right way or you will lose your soul as well." Exhausted and distraught from her day, Madeline looked dreadful as she put her keys into the top drawer of her entryway table and looked at herself in the mirror hanging above it. She lit several protection candles as she walked through the kitchen and into the living room. She had forgotten about the shambles her apartment had been left in hours before, and empty alcohol bottles and junk food wrappers still covered the coffee table and floor. "Welcome home, Gabriella. Seems the years have found you unchanged," she said, taking out a large garbage bag and reluctantly cleaning up the mess. The black computer bag Gabriella had possessively yanked away the previous day lay open on the floor, sparking Madeline's interest. She picked it up and sat down on the couch. Inside were dozens of black and white journal notebooks, one of which she took out and casually flipped through. After focusing on a few random entries Gabriella had written about her daily inpatient life, Madeline disregarded it. Journaling was an integral part of patient ritual and rehabilitation, and although Madeline didn't utilize that method with her patients, she knew many other doctors who did. She put the notebook back into the bag, set it aside to bring to Gabriella the next day, and continued to clean the room. After picking up a half-full bottle of vodka off the floor, Madeline was ready to numb the pain of the day with the first of her nightly series of cocktails. As she lifted the bottle to her mouth, ready to indulge in a nice long drink, she stopped herself. "What am I doing? This is destroying my already screwed up life," she thought, taking one last look at the bottle in her hand before smashing it against the brick wall and storming over to the bar cabinet. She grabbed hold of the heavy piece of furniture and slammed it over violently. Bottles of liquor and crystal glasses shattered all over the floor.